For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Leap. I'm from Region 2. I'm the Project Delivery Program Coordinator.
Oh, and I got food in my mouth.
And he's John Mackler. He's from Region 1.
I'm the planning manager.
He's a planning manager. So anyway, we've been asked here to talk about scoping. And so in the agenda, we're going to talk about the life cycle. Here you see this. I think we've called it sort of the racetrack. And we've got another slide, a little bit sort of detail. We're going to just talk about it briefly. Some of the objectives, some of the different forms you've been maybe have been utilizing, but maybe didn't even know why you've been utilizing, other than just saying, hey, I've got this form, fill it out. And then depending on the time that we've got, because I think we've got about 25 minutes, we've got some other topics we can go over depending on the questions and the time that we have. So next slide, please. So this is the sort of the life cycle. This is a more of a, what I'll call drill down view of this thing. And what we're talking about there is, and you can see is like, okay, can everybody read that? It's like, no, you can't, because you're not supposed to. So the next slide here, what we're focusing on right now is scoping. And so you may have been assigned a project and you'd say, okay, go out and scope it, but maybe you didn't even know, well, how did I get here? Or how did this project become, as far as a project? So if you look back, and there's back in this sort of the needs list, and there's different, yeah, there you go, right there. Some of these different attributes that will generate a project. So whether there's either systems, and we call it sort of the fix-it program, and that's like bridge, pres, operations, et cetera. There's the competitive process. There's the other side of the equation, the enhanced projects, and that's more like applications. And then some of the planning side, like John's side. And that brings out sort of a needs list, and out of that, I think you've heard of maybe even called a sort of like a 200 to 300% list, and then what we end up scoping is a 150% list. But in order to scope something, you have to have a document to work from. So it's the business case, and for those of you that have been here quite a while, before a business case form was created, when people go out and you'd have scoping teams, and she's going, no. There would be teams that would go out and scope, and then everybody would get out there and goes, do you know what we're scoping? I don't know. Do you know what we're scoping? And that's how chaotic it was. When the business case form came along, everybody's going, this is great, because now it sort of focused in a little bit on what we're talking about. So John is going to talk next about as far as the business case, a little bit more of the meat and potatoes behind that.
So one point I want to touch on before we move on, this scoping phase, once you're given this business case, the word that comes to my mind is investigation. And you've probably scoped like a vacation you've gone on and decided what to do and what not to do. So scoping is something that I don't want you to overthink it. It's a common sense thing. You do this activity in your personal life, and you probably do it really well because it's led you to this career. And in this career, you're constantly balancing risk. And this whole thing is about balancing risk so that you get it right. Okay. This business case form, one of my mentors described it to me as the what and the why, right? And as Steve said, the alternative is if you don't know what you're supposed to scope and you don't know why you're supposed to scope it, how are you supposed to take the first step? So the business case makes the case for a project. The bridge is going to fall down. The pavement is going to deteriorate from a minor rehabilitation to a major rehabilitation. There's no place for people to walk safely or to bike safely. There's a high crash rate. It's the why. So if you've ever tried to win an argument and you have to go and you have to start with explaining to someone why this matters, why is this important? Think about communicating to the taxpayer. Why should we spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on this project? So it makes the case. The second thing that the business case does, as Steve mentioned, is it's like an instruction manual. And I have 4 kids, so I've done a lot of IKEA assembling. So from the chuckles, I know that you also have experienced both good and bad instruction manuals. A good business case is like a good instruction manual. You open that up and you're like, I got this, I can do this, hold my beer. So if you get
instructions?
Right, exactly. So imagine getting a business case that tells you, look, what you're going to do here is you are going to scope, repaving this highway from point A to point B. You don't have to wonder whether you're also supposed to replace the bridge or the culvert or ignore the signal, or it tells you you are supposed to do those things. So it's really clear about what you're doing and why, the extent of it. What it does not do, it does not define who and how. And so earlier when Jeff Flowers was up here talking about how to write that project description, what was his thing? Vague but flexible, or succinct but flexible, yeah? We're kind of in that same space. You want the business case to be specific enough so that if you're a scoping team leader or a contributor as a technical expert, you know what you're working on. But maybe you don't prescribe, you're gonna do a full signal replacement. Okay, but the business case doesn't say, oh, and by the way, you're gonna plant the 14-inch mast arm, the pole here, and you're going to hang it here. No. That's for the project delivery team. The business case is just supposed to tell you what problem you're trying to fix and why it's important to fix. Okay. The second, am I doing this or are you doing this?
Yep, you are.
I am, okay. That was sort of the first thing my motto on that slide was invest strategically. Sometimes we see a business case before we get into scoping and it's clearly a terrible idea, right? It's not a need that we need to address. Or among all of our needs, once you actually have to write down why you want to fix it, you realize that's not a very good reason. So the business case helps us allocate our resources strategically. The second step, oh yeah, jump in.
One thing I was going to mention too, that as we've talked about the business case and you've gone out there and you've scoped and as the project lead and you're going, okay, good, I'm done with it. One of the things that is also new, I think, with this scoping cycle compared to last time we just created the business case, is that there are the people that generated the business case, so your program fund managers or whatever. Then you got your project team that said, okay, here's what we scoped, and here was the solution that we said, okay, here's what this is. And there's an initial cost that said, okay, repair bridge, $3 million. The team goes out there and goes, this thing needs to be replaced, $10 million. We've got a feedback loop this cycle, and there's actually, each region has a business case gatekeeper. I happen to be that one for Region 2, but we go back to the program fund manager and we say, here's what the scoping team came up with. Are you okay with this? Because they may say, I'm not going to fund it, but I agree with what their solution is based on what they said. Or it's like, I have a project the other day, just came up, the program fund manager says, wait a second, the solution that the team says, you can't do that, so now I got to go back to the team, say, is this what you guys meant? So until we get an affirmation on both sides, there will not be that final business case signed off. So that's another piece of this equation that is probably new with this go-round.
Yeah, great. Okay. You remember Lassie and the Tommy take-home message? Anybody? No, not a lot of Lassie viewers.
Yourself.
I know. Okay, here's the one word I want you to take away from this presentation. It's risk. So write that down, big letters, draw a box around it, underline it, stars. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, scoping is a risk management exercise. The reason it's a risk management exercise is because of the headaches that Jeff Flowers and Amanda experience over here. But we all bear responsibility for managing risk. So if you can get yourself into that mindset of risk, now risk can kind of go two ways. If you gave me infinite budget to do scoping, I could scope the heck out of this. We could basically go to DAP and scoping, right? And we could iron out every risk. And then we would only program projects that were really highly refined. And then we would never have amendments because we had just scoped, we had gotten to 30% design and scoping. The amount of time and the amount of money that would take represents a risk. On the other end, we can try to spend as little as possible on scoping. We can really kind of have half-baked projects where we're like, yeah, it's a bridge. Bridges usually cost what, $400 or $500 million? That'll be good, right? Well, that would be a different kind of risk because then you'd have a ton of amendments because you went into this kind of blind. So this is how you manage risk, how far you chase it, how much time, how much resources, because If you are a tech center staff, if you're a roadway engineer, if you're a traffic engineer, if you do traffic control, geohydro, the time you're spending on scoping is time you're not spending maybe delivering other projects. In this cycle, a team that was going through the Transportation Leadership Institute developed a tool. I just call it the TLI risk calculator. I don't know what its real name is. But it's a pretty simple spreadsheet tool that lets you ask yourself across 5 measures how much risk you're carrying. What it does is it spits out a contingency rate between 20 and 50%. So if you did a bridge as lump sum and you're like, $10 million because it's a bridge and bridges cost $10 million, I'm going to give you pretty high, you want to have a pretty high contingency because you didn't look at that. If you did pavement and you got down to bid items and you did quality control on your bid items and you've looked at everything, you might be able to get yourself down to a 20% contingency rate. That reflects a risk management decision, because if we spend less time on scoping and accept a 50% contingency, there's a certain risk associated with carrying that much contingency at the start of the process, because you're locking up money. There's an opportunity cost to that money. That could be another project. If you put 50% contingency on a $10 million bridge, that's another bridge. On the other hand, if you assume that you're so certain everything is so clear that you deserve a 20% contingency, but you really weren't so clear, you really didn't scope it enough, then you're going to run into cost overrun problems, and that carries a different kind of cost. So risk, this whole exercise is managing risk.
Let me add one piece to that. And if you were to talk to any of your region managers when it comes to assigning risk and being more risk averse, when they have to go to the OTC and explain why they're over on a project and they've got to seek approval from the OTC, and when they get raked over the coals for, seems like hours on end, they'll tell you, I want as much contingency as possible in there, so you need to convince them as to why should it be 20% versus 85%. Because again, they need to make sure that, and again, like for Region 2, our region manager says, tell me a time when we have ever given money back, as opposed to saying, yeah, I need 10 million more. So again, when you look at risk, you need to make sure we're conservative, because I'll tell you, for those of you who've been around enough, when ADA became an issue, there was a lawsuit that hit all of our projects. And when we were doing the 1821 STIP, we scoped, there was no such thing as this ADA lawsuit. So now, fast forward, and it's hit us big time, and we have, it's like 40,000, it's a bajillion ADA ramps that we got to get done in so many years. How many? 27,000. 27,000, close to a bajillion. and so it is, it seems like it.
Hey, the next slide's yours anyway. We can...
Okay, and so anyway, just when we talk about risk, so another thing that this next slide, we talk about, it says creating knowledge. One of the things that, we've created a task force, and so there's a, from each region, there's a representative. I happen to represent Region 2 from a scoping coordinator. So in our prior scoping cycles, each region, as they would scope the different documents they would gather, they would go, I don't know where it is. And the farther back you went, it's like, I don't know. Do you know? Is it somebody's desktop? It was lost. And so one of the things that we said when ProjectWise came along, if people, this is really a snapshot of ProjectWise, for the 21-24 STIP, we said, we're doing design, we're doing construction in ProjectWise, we really should capture all the different documentation of scoping, place it in ProjectWise as well. So everything in 21-24 is in there, because if you have all this information, and it costs us a lot of money to gather all this, if you don't have it stored anywhere, what good is it if you can't retrieve it? And so one of the things that we're also doing too is, as in for 1821, each of the regions were charged with all the scoping that they did do and the documents that they could find. We're pushing back in to ProjectWise. So we're working our way back, and I've gone back even as far as like a 15, 18. But all that information, it takes time, but once you get it in there, you can pluck it out at any moment's notice, because of the the search capabilities that ProjectWise has. So it is really important, and what you're looking at, go back real quick. So one of the things that, if you're familiar, if you've seen this, in the scoping, there's these 4 folders: a temp folder, scoping docs, photos, supporting docs. Everything initially starts out, the business case, the different forms in the supporting docs, and then the scoping coordinator will take certain things once that project team has completed everything, and they will move stuff. You notice these documents down here. These are actually the documents that end up in the scoping docs. They're in a PDF format. They're locked down. They're final. So those are information that can be used for later downstream when we're in design. Because what's interesting, and John mentioned this very correctly, when we're in design and we have the project team that's in design, the different designers, and they're going, so what is it that we're designing? They need to go back and look at the documentation, all that information that we did when we're in scoping. So the more that information is available and that we were articulate enough to have that information, the easier it is, and it helps assign risk to say what we did back then, we know going forward. So with that, so sort of round 1 here, questions on what we've talked about or anything related to scoping. One of the things that we're learning and playing catch up in ProjectWise is the scoping information that we have and determining, well, what should be in there, what are some new things that project delivery has come up with, and we've got some subsequent slides sort of talks to that. But even I would say even at the very front end, what we've been talking about is from even the planning folks have been saying, well, what stuff should we have in there so when project delivery is working on a project, what information should, so I think that's an ongoing, and I've seen a number of documents even since we've just started the 21-24, that we've brought in new forms, new processes, put them in ProjectWise to make them available for the team. The question is like, right now when we've been doing the scoping for 21-24, of course none of those projects would have been funded yet, so you were just in scoping. But I remember I mentioned earlier, we've got their 1821, and the regions sort of were tasked with, well, whatever you can find and whenever time allows, put all those in ProjectWise under a scoping regimen as well. So what he's talking about is, well, I've got this project in design, and I believe that maybe those documents that are scoping are in there as well. We are probably, what is this, April? It's probably about the ProjectWise administration. They're working on a process that for any project that has gone into design, they are going to sort of search ProjectWise, find those folders, because what you're talking about right now, sort of the stopgap measure is just saying, I'm in design, and I think under the subfolder is called project management, if I remember right, that they're putting a link there that goes back to the scoping folder. What's going to happen in May, whenever, is under design, you got all the subfolders, that whole scoping and the different layout, that whole folder of scoping will be brought in, dropped right underneath design. So you'll see the key number, then you have all the different subfolders. That scoping will just be a subfolder under there. So that is being worked on as we speak. The ProjectWise administration, that they need to write up the rules about it, what the process, how can they streamline it. So that's being worked on as we speak. In each region, I think in Region 1, they took the approach that once the scoping has been done, there is the sort of the estimate that is developed to say, here's how much a project costs. And so I think in Region 1, they hired the consultant to create all those, generate all those. And if we're in Region 2, what we had talked about, we said, okay, all the folks that are assigned to scoping, you have your day job, and it's like, okay, where do I fit scoping in? It's like, well, I don't know, whenever I'll do it. And so we talked about it. We had put together in Region 2 a scoping committee, and we said, so would it work for us to be able to offload some of this scoping effort, hire a consultant, have them do this? and there was a lot of consternation around with our designers, and they were saying, yeah, they don't know anything, they don't know the ODOT way. And we said, well, how are we going to know if we don't try? So we did a couple of pilot projects. We did arts. There was a handful of arts projects. I think a lot of them were like on the local system. We also did in the local bridge. Region 2 has the most. I think we had like 23 bridges that we had to scope. And so we did 8 or 9 of those that we had hired a consultant. So we're going to now look at that, and there'll be a debrief once we're all done with this, and we're going to say, the product that the consultant came up with, how well was it? How detailed was it? Does it pass muster with what we did internally? So that sort of remains to be seen, what Bill's bringing up, but if it's really a good job, then maybe we want to offload more of that for next scoping cycle. So
I think we're about to get
yeah.
the hook. One of the so there's 3 topics that got sort of big in this phase of scoping. One was advanced investigations. Headline version of this is, let's say you do your scoping, you hit that, you balance your risk, and it's just obvious that there's especially some data, like what's underneath the pavement, what's, you have to do some some geo explorations maybe. So while we were in scoping, there was a lot of work happening statewide about this concept of advanced investigations, how to fund it, when to do it. So that's a phrase to keep your ear out for. Another one, the OTC gave us a pot of money called leverage. One of the tough things that you may have experienced is you're delivering a project, you're working on your charter, and someone says, oh, could you also do some sidewalk infill? And you're thinking, sure, give me the money to do it. No money forthcoming. So this time the OTC created 3 pots of money for active transportation, safety, and highway operations, so that when we want to add scope to a project, there is money to come with it. So that's the second topic. And then the third one came out of the legislature. They said, oh, and by the way, for certain projects, we're going to require that you do a benefit cost analysis. So these are 3 sort of new phenomena. There are always things. The guardrail thing came out in the middle of this season. It's kind of like ADA came out before. So we don't get to press pause on the universe while we scope. So these are 3 of the things that were kind of a big deal during this season. That we could have spent 25 minutes on these topics. So we picked the ones we did. If you are curious, if you're starting to think, I need to know more about this, I want to know more, we gave you the 3 topics that we focused on, the invest strategically, the manage risk, the create knowledge. And then these are 3 other things that would be like your master's level degree type of information to get into the advanced investigations, to get into benefit cost, and to get into the leverage. So we wanted to throw those up there so that you're aware that they're out there. But man, it would be like a whole other hour to cover them in sufficient detail.
So we have just a couple minutes left. Any questions on these? One, just real quick on the advanced investigation. One of the things that we found out, or a lot of times what would happen, we'd be in design and we'd be maybe all the way about to DAP, and we go, oh, we just started looking at this stuff and goes, this is going to throw this way off. It's going to delay everything. And so we started saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if we did this advanced investigation in advance of this? And so, well, go figure, that's a novel thought. And so that's what that all came about. And so there's some, I think we start with like bridge, pres, ops, and geohydro or something like that, pavement. And so it's in those areas that we try to do some due diligence in an ideal world, even before we started design. And then you know a little bit more about that project, but this is it's a new thing and we're just starting to get it, but the more that we can do in front of this, the better off. So I think that's sort of the main takeaway from that. So.